So the course initially arose out of the fact that I was just having spontaneous conversations with students who were taking my other classes, which were on, elections or democratic citizenship, democratic theory more generally. But many of my students had questions about the ethics of, their own activist activities or kind of things that they were seeing in the news. And I was interested in just sort of having a kind of a bigger structure for having these conversations with students, in large part because I didn't, have a good sense of, what had been written or said about this, and had spent most of my time thinking about these kinds of highly institutionalized practices. And I think of activism as being, the kind of other side of the coin, things that are sort of, even though they're impacted by institutions and rules, they're often kind of what makes activism interesting is precisely that it's often challenging the way things have been done and sort of innovating and kind of surprising us with new democratic practices. So anyway, so that's to say, like, I didn't feel like I was coming into that class from a position of expertise, but rather it was a kind of structure for me to have interesting conversations with students as well as to learn about something that I thought I might eventually want to write about. Um, and I did learn a lot. I think that I came into that class maybe thinking, as I had mentioned, some people sometimes do, that the student activists on campus were maybe not super thoughtful or kind of hadn't, developed a set of principles about kind of how their work intersects with democratic principles. And I found I was quite wrong. Most of my students in that first class were far better read than I was on a lot of these issues. I would assign certain readings and they would come back and say, well, oh, how does this thing that King, we would read Letter from Birmingham Jail, and they would say, well, okay, well, how does this fit with, these 6 other books by King and sort of other civil rights leaders that I've read, and like, how does this view develop over time? How is it related to the fact, the kind of relationship with Gandhi and the sort of Indian home rule movement? And yeah, so out of that, kind of having taught it a couple of times now, I sort of I'm starting to learn a lot more from kind of both my students' own experiences and the background that they're bringing in, as well as the kind of processes of um, preparing a class where you sort of end up reading pretty widely. And it's been a lot of fun for me. And the class has definitely developed a lot over time as I've, learned more about the kinds of ethical frameworks that activists are bringing to bear that have been developed within movements or that have been kind of pulled into to different movements. But it is a sort of interesting class because it's at this, on the one hand, this kind of, there's this interest in this sort of specific subject matter of activism, but it's also an introductory ethics class. And so I generally tell my students when I'm coming in that's like, I'm learning a lot about activism, but I do have some expertise in sort of, the academic study of ethics and how it's taught. And I'll kind of say, like, I think what's really useful about kind of taking the sort of standard frameworks of academic ethics is that, it sort of forces us to approach these kinds of texts or questions from different perspectives. And so generally, my kind of goal for students in that class is to kind of give them multiple different lenses through which to look at kind of ethical problems, but with the idea that, over time of developing practice of examining ethical questions in depth and sort of challenging maybe their own kind of instinctive or intuitive reactions, that they can come to develop a sort of a source of kind of internal ethical guidance that they find, both allows them to sort of move through the world, but also, kind of challenges them in a way where they are sort of really thinking about and reflecting on what they're doing.